og velkommen til Samtaler om Fremtiden. Jeg er i dag i Chicago, midtby, og jeg sidder med Rob, and now I'm gonna switch to English because that's probably easier for you, or?
Tusen tak.
That was almost Danish, a little bit Swedish, but...
It's Norwegian, I think.
Or Norwegian, all right. So, hi Rob, and thank you for being here. Could you tell a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So I'm a professor of innovation at Northwestern University here in Chicago, and I look at innovation in large established organizations. But the last few years I've been spending more and more time thinking about how technology might change the experience of being human the rest of the century. What is that going to mean for us as individuals, as communities, governments, organizations trying to make these transitions? Not in the next 3 to 5 years so much, although I'm looking at this time frame for cues. My colleague Moran Cerf, who's a neuroscientist at Northwestern, he and I are thinking about 30 years, 50 years, 70 years out. What might these transitions mean for the human experience?
Okay, wow. Okay, so I definitely want to hear about that. So in this show, we talk about what technologies and future technologies are doing to us as humans, our society, and it sounds a lot like what you're looking into.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the great opportunities and the challenges with the new technologies?
Well, obviously that's a grand space, but I'll start all the way at the top. The transition of the next 100 years that we've been thinking a lot about, and we've done some writing on this, more to come. I believe that there are two sort of meta trends that stand above the others that will occur through the rest of the century that will create at the end of that process a dramatically different kind of human experience and social structures, et cetera, than we've ever seen before. Now, I'm a lover of history and philosophy. I've studied history my whole life. It's my first love, in fact. But there are so many aspects of how the world will change for us as humans over the next century that it's hard to find anchors in history. This is not to say that there aren't lots of meaningful transitions that we've been through as human beings in the past 30,000 years or so. But the factors that will make this change happen will shift the nature of human relationships and interactions so dramatically in such a short period of time. I don't think we have a real guide stone for that. So for human history, we've sought to see deeper and further, whether that's with a microscope or a telescope or sensing radio waves, for instance, and using them for various things we can't see, we couldn't see naturally before technology. And so we've been making this transition for centuries, but it will become much more dramatic. When we talk about transparency, and actually Moran Cerf and I talk about this as hypertransparency. The reason is it will be deeper and more invasive, our ability to see into things than we've ever seen before. I'll give you an example.
Exactly.
So some of Moran's work in neuroscience helped contribute to the ability that we now have, and this is verifiable, published, others have repeated the experiment, to see what people are dreaming while they're having the dream. To see on a screen what is being dreamt about. Now,
I don't know if that's a good idea.
Well,
when it comes
it's
to
definitely not a good idea. Imagine explaining that to your spouse or partner. I wasn't there. Well, it's in your dream. But this is already possible. Now, to be clear, the technology right now allows us to see that maybe there's a tree and there are a couple of people, but you can't tell who the people are. Or it's very fuzzy. It's incredibly fuzzy. But clearly over the next 10, 20, 30 years, that capability will become more and more capable. And we'll be able to see in more and more detail this invasive level of transparency into the human mind and psyche, as well as supply chains around the world having sensors and collecting data. So these are all aspects of pushing toward greater and greater transparency. But we call it hypertransparency because, for instance, if you're seeing someone's dream as they're having it, are you seeing something real per se? I mean, it's certainly not what we consider as default reality here. It's not something that's actually happens.
Unconscious.
It's something happening in a cognitive mental system that we're not entirely sure what's going on. But we'll be able to see it, and we also call it hyperreality or hypertransparency, following on Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher who came up with the concept of hyperreality. If you're not familiar with it, I'd recommend going and reading some Baudrillard and reflecting on where we are now with fake news, issues with trust in media, reality TV, maybe even reality TV happening in the White House, for instance. Baudrillard was talking about this, much to our chagrin. Baudrillard was talking about this in the early 80s.
Yeah, so, but let's, just stay where we are.
Great.
So I personally see both challenges and opportunities with this hyper transparency.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Sure. Well, let's start with abundance, because the challenges are already present and obvious. So oftentimes when I say we're heading toward a world of abundance, again, many others are also saying this, many other people read that as saying, oh, everything's going to be great because everything will be free. And that's not really what we're saying. When we talk about transitioning into abundance, we mean that a variety of kinds of resources, capabilities, even energy, for instance, a good example, will become closer and closer to free. So energy is probably the best example. Nearly everything we do requires energy in some way, especially when we're reliant on technology for experiences or communications or anything else. And we already have free energy. We've had free energy for the history of the planet. It's called the sun, but we haven't been very good at harnessing it. As we all know, right now, the cost of harnessing solar energy is plummeting. And there are also other modalities beyond solar that will, over the rest of this century, bring the price of energy closer and closer to zero. So this means an extraordinary amount of abundance, the ability for more and more people to do more and more things. But abundance doesn't necessarily mean it's all great. And I'll give you an example from right here today. We have evolved in a context of scarcity. For all of human existence, we evolved in a context of scarcity, and so thus when we...
Meaning there's not enough
stuff. Food, water, resource, whatever it is. So therefore our systems, our natural systems, encouraged us to eat when there was food available, and particularly to crave fats and sugars, because fats and sugars were high quality nutrition, energy, and signaled things that we should be. So now that we're in a context already in many parts of the world, not everywhere, not everyone, but in many parts of the world where essentially food is available all day long in as much abundance as you would like at fairly low cost. And so what do we see in developed societies and increasingly in other parts of the world as well, but problems with obesity, particularly here in my own country, in the United States, obesity, diabetes, etc. Human beings do not have a record of making good decisions faced with abundance. And a large part of the reason is we did not evolve in a context of this kind of abundance.
So we are already having a new experience within the context we're in, but we haven't, our hardware and software hasn't developed into the new era we're in. So, but if we're not ready for this era, how can we be ready for hyper reality?
Well, the reality is we're never ready. That's part of living. If you were always ready for everything that was coming, it would be pretty boring, a pretty stultifying life. So
I'm still curious, Rob, to what am I gonna, like, what experiences am I gonna have? Will I see other things that I don't see now? Will I develop senses that I don't have now? Or
a key part of all of these transitions into what we call a post-virtual world, which we can come back to, will be these invisible interfaces. So to make it really clear, interfaces, most people would think of keyboards, we've had others like punch cards and things like this, ways to interface with computing systems. And then now there's voice, people are very excited about where that's going. Haptics, moving your hand and communicating with computer systems, for instance. An invisible interface is simply a direct brain-computer interface. And the way to think about it is, if I ask you, Christina, what's 2 plus 2? Your answer is?
4.
Great, not a trick question. And from where did that come? It happened. You didn't have to push any buttons, it just came to mind. Now, what if I said to you, what's 8,474 divided by 6 cube roots squared? What's the answer?
I'd probably use my cell phone.
Well, there you go. And I have no idea either. I just made that up. But with an invisible interface, rather than picking up your cell phone and punching a bunch of buttons, you would think, and the will of, I need the answer to this, and the answer will come to you. just like 2 + 2 = 4.
So how does that work? Do you implement something to the brain, or do you modify in CRISPR, or what do you do?
Well, there are a number of people working on various approaches to make this happen. So there's Neuralink, which is an Elon Musk company. Brian Johnson has a company called Kernel. He's invested in attempting to, they've both invested in attempting to advance brain-computer interfaces. So it's not entirely clear what will end up working. It's also far harder to make that integration happen than many people had expected. But so far, there's no reason to believe that we won't overcome those technical limitations.
So do you, is this, you call it beyond a virtual reality? So, right?
Right. So the
well,
way.
so is this also comparable to what some people call transhumanism?
That there's an aspect of that, but I'm setting that aside partly because, and I follow it, I'm interested in it, but transhumanism also ends up having some almost religious notions or connotations to it, and I'm trying to avoid too much of that.
Okay.
But I'm not, and I learned this term from my friend Esther Dyson. I'm not a human patriot. She said that to me, and I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, if we end up cybernetically enhanced, if we end up integrated directly with AI systems, which I agree we will be, if we end up changing our genetic code or even transcending our physical bodies in some way 100 years from now, and the Homo sapien sapien goes away, I'm okay with that.
Well, it's evolution, right?
It is a form of evolution, and we used to call artificial selection, and we're experimenting on ourselves. But transhumanism is one part of, or an overlap with, this notion of what Moran and I are calling the post-virtual world. So what do we mean by this? It has a very specific moment where there'll be a transition into a post-virtual world, and that will be the moment where, or the span of time, relatively narrow span of time, where we will no longer be able to tell we're in a virtual space from default reality. So where we are right now on this terrace in Chicago is default reality. Everything is what we know as real. But right now, if you want a virtual experience, you might do it on your phone, or if you have the goggles, you put the goggles on and you're in a virtual space. Even though they're getting better and better, you still know you're in a virtual space. You got it, you take the goggles off, you're out of the space. But as this becomes more comprehensive, as the experience becomes deeper and more comprehensive and all-encompassing, even incorporating our bodily function, our embodied cognition, etc., then there will become a point where it will be indistinguishable whether you're in a virtual space or a default space. Now, you might know that you're in that space, but the experience itself is indistinguishable. And once we have passed into that new world, we call this post-virtual. Because when we're in that new world, no one's going to say, hey, Christina, do you want to meet in the virtual space or at that real cafe? That distinction won't make much difference or sense. It'll just be another dimension of our reality. We believe sometime this century, probably in the next 20 or 30 years, this will all become possible. But if it's 70 years, that's not part of our project to determine whether it's 30 years or 70 years. But the fact is, it will happen this century. And in the grand swath of human history, 1 century isn't very long. And this transition is coming fast into this post-virtual space. And note that when we transition from opacity and scarcity to a context of abundance and transparency, this will be the first time in human history that we have existed within that context. And we have no social, economic, political, faith-based, cultural systems that have any experience whatsoever in history of dealing in that sort of a human context.
I'm very excited about what you're talking about. I'm going to look some of the stuff up. So thank you so much for being here today with me.
And Christina, thank you. I want to say one more thing. What you're doing is essential. We need more of it because the public dialogue right now is dysfunctional. People either seem to think that the robots are going to take all of our jobs and then kill us in some sort of robot apocalypse, or on the other hand, everything will be abundant and free and wonderful and everything will be great. Obviously, the reality is somewhere in the gray between, and we need to spend more time considering it.
Thank you, Rob. I agree. It's nice that we can have this conversation here, and hopefully we'll start conversations in more places than just here between us. So
Great.
Thank you.
Great, and I hope to see you for Twin Global 2019 as well.
Me too. All right. Tusind tak, fordi I har set med i samtaler om fremtiden i dag. I skal lige se lidt af Chicago. I'm just going to show a little bit of Chicago. You got to get to see some of the view here. Look, fantastic buildings around us. Yeah. All right, Rob. I guess that's it for today. I'm off to LA. Thank you again so much.
Tusind tak.
Selv tak. Hej.